Snow packed her mouth shut on purpose. Dyani had chosen this burial, and what she'd whisper when the digging stopped would change his life forever. Cold had already eaten past her fingers into bone by the time she stopped fighting it, because fighting it was the one thing that would give her away. Somewhere above the drift, men on horses were counting her people among the dead, and the only way to make that count true was to lie still enough, long enough, for a corpse's stillness to become believable. Beside her, wedged so close, their shoulders had frozen together. Her aunt's breath came slower with every hour, and Dyani could not tell any more whether the woman beside her was resting or dying. She did not know yet that the stranger who found her would carry a secret worth more than every ounce of silver those men were hunting, because the secret buried under that snow was never silver at all. This is New Mexico territory, the first hard snow of 1885, and the woman beneath that drift is Dyani, a young Apache woman whose village burned 3 days earlier at the hands of 8 men who believe her family guards the map to a fortune. The man riding toward her without knowing it yet is Silas Kerr, a quiet cowboy who has spent most of his life keeping his distance from other people's troubles and is about to lose that habit for good. What Dyani and her aunt Nascha are hiding under that snow will pull Silas into a hunt he never chose, and by the time it ends, he will have earned something he never rode out looking for. Stay with this one to the end, because the moment those 2 women open their eyes and whisper 2 words to a stranger is only the beginning of what they're about to reveal. The first heavy snow of the season had come early that year, dropping out of a pale morning sky and swallowing the high country before noon. Ranchers who'd meant to finish one more day of work rode for home instead. Travelers who'd trusted the calendar found themselves caught on open trail with the wind turning to teeth. Even the game vanished into whatever cover the forest could give, the way animals disappear when they sense something men have already stopped noticing. Only one rider kept moving through it, a lone shape working steadily higher into country that had shut its doors to everyone else. Silas Kerr knew these mountains the way a man knows a hard neighbor, with respect and no illusion that respect bought him safety. He'd crossed lonely stretches of territory for 20 years, and this storm was simply one more lesson in a country that never once apologized for teaching it. His horse pushed through drifts already past its knees, ears flat against a wind coming from every direction at once. Silas pulled his coat tighter and dropped the brim of his hat, doing the math on daylight and distance the way he always did, not liking the answer any better this time. He had built his whole life around exactly this kind of solitude, long rides between towns that never held him for more than a season, work that asked nothing of a man but his hands and his patience. He'd never married, never put down the kind of roots a wife and a porch and a row of children required, and most days he told himself that was simple preference rather than something he'd never let himself risk. He was good company for a horse, and passable company for a fire, and he had long since stopped expecting more out of any given winter than that. He'd hoped to reach an old line cabin before dark, a trapper's shelter he'd used twice before, and with every mile the wind stole from him, that hope shrank smaller. What unsettled him more than the cold was the quiet. A storm this size usually carried its own noise, branches cracking under new weight, some distant animal complaining to no one. This one carried almost nothing, just whined, endless and toneless, filling every space where another sound should have lived. His horse stopped without warning. The animal lifted its head, ears swiveling toward a narrow valley walled in by dark pine, and would not take another step, no matter how firmly he pressed it. He'd learned a long time ago not to argue with that particular stillness. The horse had kept him alive more than once by noticing trouble before he did, and he wasn't fool enough to spend those minutes arguing over daylight. He swung down, boots sinking almost to his knees in snow, untouched by anything but wind, and looked across ground that gave him at first glance nothing at all. Then he saw it. A scrap of blue cloth, caught on a low branch, fluttering weak and stubborn against a field of unbroken white. It had no business being there. No traveler in weather like this, hung cloth from a tree, and nothing about the fabric looked worn enough to have hung through a full season. Silas waded toward it, each step an effort, and when he closed his hand around it, he understood it hadn't been tied there at all. It had torn free of something, and the wind had carried it exactly this far, before catching it on the branch and letting it go no further. Someone had passed through here recently. His chest went tight in a way the cold alone hadn't managed. He searched the ground around the tree, but the storm had already scrubbed away whatever trail might have led here, leaving only the faintest depressions beneath a fresh skin of snow. More suggestion than evidence. Any sensible man would have turned back. Daylight was failing fast, and the wind was climbing toward something worse than what it had already thrown at him. But Silas had built a life out of not looking away from the one detail that didn't belong, and a torn scrap of blue cloth was already burning a hole through his glove. He tied his horse to the same branch and pushed deeper into the valley on foot, following a trail he could barely see, and trusted anyway. The wind screamed harder between the rock walls closing in around him. Snow drove into his face with enough force that he had to squint to keep his bearings. Then, underneath the wind, he caught something else. A sound so thin he nearly convinced himself he'd imagined it. He stopped dead, breath held, heart working harder than the climb alone accounted for. It came again, faint, ragged, unmistakably human. Not the cry of a struggling animal. A voice. Silas moved as fast as the drifts allowed, which wasn't fast at all, boots punching through crust into snow that swallowed him to mid-thigh in places. The sound seemed to vanish, then return from a different angle, bouncing strange off the rock, the way sound did in country like this. He pushed toward a steep slope where broken boulders rose out of the white like something frozen mid-collapse, and there, half lost against the pale ground, he saw a single gloved hand. Only the fingers showed above the surface, curled and still. He did not waste a second thinking about it. He dropped to his knees and dug with both hands, tearing through snow the wind had packed hard as stone. His fingers went numb inside his gloves within moments, but he worked faster with every handful he cleared until he uncovered an arm, then a shoulder, then the pale, cold face of a young woman wrapped in heavy hides that had done almost nothing to hold the warmth in. Her lips had gone the color of ash. Her breath was so shallow, he had to lean close just to be certain it was there at all. She was alive. Relief hit him hard enough to shake his hands worse than the cold had, and then it drained away just as fast, because as he cleared more snow around her, he saw her hand was still reaching, stretched toward another place in the drift where the surface sat a little too smooth, a little too even. Someone else was buried beside her. Silas dug faster than he had ever dug in his life. The ice hidden beneath the surface snow tore at his palms until they bled, and he barely registered the sting. Within minutes, he had uncovered a second woman, older by the lines the cold hadn't erased from her face, no less exhausted than the first. The two of them had wrapped around each other beneath that snow, arms locked, faces pressed close, in the particular embrace of two people who had decided, without needing to put it into words, that neither one would try to survive alone. Silas understood the shape of that choice the moment he saw it. Loyalty like that didn't happen by accident. It was the only reason either woman still had a pulse to find. He checked, anyway, fingers against throats gone nearly as cold as the snow itself, and found both women clinging to life by a thread, thin enough to frighten him more than the storm had. If they stayed under that mountain another hour, neither would see morning. He didn't waste time deciding what came next. He fought his way back to the horse, hauled every blanket and length of rope he carried, and built a crude sled from lashed pine branches with hands that had stopped, fully obeying him somewhere in the last 10 minutes. Lifting two grown women onto that sled without help nearly finished what the storm had started on him, muscle and stubbornness carrying what strength alone couldn't. He worked without pausing to feel the cost of it, wrapping each woman as tight as the blankets allowed, tucking his own scarf around the older woman's throat because she had none of her own left dry enough to serve. Just before he climbed into the saddle, the younger woman's eyes opened, only for a moment. She looked straight at him, and what crossed her face wasn't the confusion he expected from someone waking half frozen out of a snowbank. It was something closer to recognition. Her lips moved, and the words came so quiet, the wind nearly took them before they reached him. "You came." Her eyes closed again before he could answer. Silas sat frozen in the saddle a moment longer than the cold accounted for, turning those two words over and finding no shape that made sense of them. Those weren't the words of a woman surprised to have been found. They were the words of someone who had been waiting, and he had no idea yet what that meant or how much it would cost him to find out. He turned the horse toward the cabin he'd been chasing all day, unaware that the two women lashed behind him carried a secret that would put him at the center of a hunt 8 men had already burned a village to win. If this is the kind of frontier story that keeps you coming back, week after week, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a member. It costs less than a cup of coffee, and it's the reason we can keep bringing you stories like Dyani's. The old trapping cabin sat beside a frozen creek, half hidden by pines that broke the worst of the wind before it reached the walls. Night had already claimed the mountains by the time Silas reached it, his hands stiff past feeling, and every muscle in his back aching from hauling that sled the whole distance. He got the horse settled in the lean-to first, out of long habit more than clear thought, before he carried the two women inside one at a time. Careful with them the way he'd have been careful with something he wasn't sure could be repaired if it broke. The cabin held little more than a stone hearth, a rough table, and 2 narrow beds pushed against opposite walls, but it offered warmth, and out here, warmth was the difference between a story with an ending and one without. Silas worked fast, despite hands that barely wanted to close around the dry wood stacked inside from some earlier season. The fire caught, spread, and began pushing its heat into corners that hadn't felt any in months. He wrapped both women in every dry blanket he owned, tucked warm stones under the bedding near their feet, and set water heating over the flames. Slowly, in the kind of increments a man only notices when he is watching that closely, color crept back into faces that had gone the gray of old ash. His own hands were split and bleeding across the knuckles by then, and he cleaned them without much attention, more concerned with the fire holding steady through the night than with anything happening to himself. Hours passed with nothing but the storm outside and the fire inside to mark them. Near midnight the older woman stirred first, her eyes opening slow and steady, taking in the room without any of the panic Silas half expected. Her gaze found him where he sat near the hearth, working a whetstone along the edge of a small blade more to keep his hands busy than out of any real need. "You saved us," her voice came rough but even. "Found you just in time from the look of it." Silas set the knife aside. She studied him a long moment, and whatever she found in that study seemed to settle something in her, because the weariness in her shoulders eased by a fraction. "It seems the mountain chose well," Silas frowned. "Ma'am, I don't follow." Before she could answer, the younger woman jolted upright beneath her blankets, breathing hard, the way a person breathes coming up out of a nightmare that hadn't finished with her yet. The older woman reached across without hesitation and laid a steadying hand on her shoulder. "It's over. We're safe now." The younger woman's eyes found Silas across the small room, and for a long stretch neither of them broke the quiet, the fire cracking louder in the silence than it had any right to. Finally she found her voice. "This is my Aunt Nascha. Silas Kerr." He offered it plain, the way he did most things, without much ceremony behind it. Neither woman reached for the food he'd set within their reach. Instead, they traded a look across the small distance between the beds, a look that carried more weight than either had put into words, and Silas had spent enough years reading trail and weather and men's intentions, to know when a silence meant something was being decided, not just endured. You two weren't just crossing these mountains. He kept it careful. Folks don't travel this country in weather like we just had without a reason big enough to risk it. Nascha let out a slow breath, one that seemed to carry something loose off her chest. You're right not to let that go. She sat up further, wincing at whatever the movement caused her, and drew a small leather pouch from beneath the layers of her clothing, tied with a cord, braided so fine it looked woven rather than knotted. She held it the way a person holds something they have protected at real cost. This is why we came. Silas half expected gold or medicine or papers of some kind. Instead, she loosened the cord and tipped a smooth, dark stone into her palm, its surface worn soft by handling, pale markings curling across it in patterns that reminded him, oddly, of water moving over rock. It belonged to my father. Nascha turned it once between her fingers. And to his father before that. Silas turned it over once in the firelight, seeing nothing in it that explained the weight both women were giving it. Looks old? It is more than old. She closed her hand around it again, protective. It marks where our people gather when trouble comes. Silas waited, the way he always waited when a story wasn't finished yet. Dyani's voice came quiet from the other bed. Our village burned 3 days ago, not soldiers, not settlers. She paused, and Silas watched something pass behind her eyes that cost her more than the cold ever had. Men who believed my family was hiding something they wanted. They tore through every lodge. Nascha's jaw tightened. When they could not find it, they burned what they could reach and followed us into the mountains. Silas felt the shape of the night rearranging itself around him. How many? 8, before we got clear of them. Their leader is a man who has spent 2 seasons buying rumors about buried Spanish silver from anyone fool enough to sell him a story. He decided somewhere along the way that our family stone was the map he needed to finally find it. He is not a patient man, and he does not forgive being wrong quietly. 8 armed men combing high country in a storm was trouble enough on its own, but one detail sat wrong in Silas's mind, and he could not leave it alone. If they wanted that stone bad enough to burn a village hunting it, why'd they leave the 2 of you buried out there? Doesn't track a man chasing something that valuable doesn't walk away from 2 witnesses still breathing. Dyani lowered her eyes to the blanket across her lap. They didn't leave us. Silas held very still. We buried ourselves. The fire popped once in the silence that followed. We knew they'd keep working the trails. Her voice stayed quiet, but steady, like she had rehearsed the telling of it somewhere in her own head. During those long hours under the snow, the storm was the only advantage we had left, so we used it. We packed the snow above us thin enough to breathe through and thick enough to look undisturbed, and we lay still, and we let the cold do the rest of the lying for us. Nascha met his eyes directly. They believe we died in that blizzard, Silas Kerr, and as long as they keep believing it, my niece and I have a kind of freedom no rifle could have bought us. Dyani had not meant to say more that night, but once the first piece of it was out, the rest came anyway, quieter, in pieces. She told him how the riders had come at dusk, 8 of them fanning out around the lodges before anyone inside had time to reach for a weapon, how the leader had walked from fire to fire demanding a stone none of the elders would admit to knowing anything about, how the torches went into the dry roofs of 2 lodges before anyone believed the threats were real. She told them about running with Nascha through smoke, thick enough to blind them both, about the sound the village made behind them, a sound she said she still heard every time the wind picked up a certain way. She did not cry telling it. Silas noticed that, and noticed, too, what it must have cost her not to. For the first time since he'd pulled that first frozen hand out of the drift, Silas understood the rescue was not the end of anything. It was where his part of this actually began. Outside, the storm had covered every track leading to this cabin, and that might buy them a day, maybe two, before the men hunting that stone widened their search and started checking every shelter this high country offered. And now, without ever choosing it, he had become part of the thing they were running from. The fire had burned low by the time the two women slept again, and Silas sat up through the worst of the night, keeping it fed, unwilling to trust the cabin's warmth to hold on its own with two people this close to the edge, still recovering inside it. Somewhere past 2 in the morning, Dyani woke again, restless, and found him still sitting there, a length of cloth wrapped clumsy around one bleeding hand. She sat up slow and reached for the cloth without asking, unwinding his poor knot and retying it properly, her fingers steady, despite everything the last 3 days had cost her. Silas let her, watching the firelight move across her face, saying nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying just then. "You'll scar," she said finally, tying off the last loop. "Wouldn't be the first." He flexed his hand once she'd finished testing the wrap. "Worth the trade, considering what I found under that snow." Something in her expression softened at that. Quiet and unguarded, in a way it hadn't been since he'd hauled her out of the drift. And for a while they sat there without speaking, the fire between them doing enough of the talking for both of them. Neither one moved to close the small distance still separating them on that narrow bench, but neither one moved away from it either. And Silas found himself more aware of that half a foot of space than he'd been aware of anything in a long while. Morning arrived clear and merciless, sunlight breaking hard off snow, so fresh it seemed to glow, the storm's fury replaced by a silence just as complete. Silas stepped outside with a bucket in one hand and his rifle slung over his shoulder, meaning nothing more than a walk to the creek for water and a look at his horse. Halfway there, he stopped. Cold tracks. Fresh ones, crossing the open ground at the tree line, careful and deliberate, the kind a man leaves when he is trying not to be noticed rather than trying to get somewhere fast. Silas crouched to read them the way he had read 1,000 trails before this one. 8 men had driven 2 women into these mountains, but the prints in front of him belonged to only 2, and they had passed close to the cabin recently. Close enough that an hour, maybe less, separated Silas from whoever had made them. He went back inside without wasting motion. "Nascha, somebody's close." Both women were on their feet before he finished the sentence. Dyani eased toward the narrow window and peered through the gap in the shutter. "I don't see anyone. They're keeping their distance on purpose." Silas set the bucket down untouched. "That worries me more than if they'd walked right up to the door." Nascha's hand closed tighter around the pouch at her chest. "Scouts? They'll be careful and they'll be thorough about it. If they find this cabin, more of them follow inside the hour." The room held quiet a moment. 3 people running the same hard math 3 different ways. Then Nascha broke it, her voice steady, despite everything the last 3 days had cost her. "There's another place. My people built a hunting shelter years back, north of here. Very few outside our own families know it stands at all. How far? If the snow's not too deep in the passes, we can reach it before dark." Silas looked out through the shutter gap one more time at ground that had already betrayed too much. Staying was no longer a choice that made sense. Within the hour they had packed what they could carry, blankets and dried food and water, lashed to Silas's horse, the leather pouch tucked deep inside Dyani's coat, where no amount of searching would find it easily. Before they left, Silas worked backward through the cabin, scattering fresh snow across every footprint, brushing the doorway clean, buying whatever extra hours he could out of a trail he couldn't fully erase. Then the 3 of them started the climb north. The trail steepened with every mile, snow deep enough in places to reach their knees, slowing every step to something closer to waiting than walking. Silas offered more than once to carry Dyani's share of the load, and each time she refused him, with the same tired, unbending smile. "We survived the mountain." She adjusted the pack against her shoulder. "I can still carry a blanket." There was something in the set of her shoulders when she said it that Silas found himself noticing more than the words themselves. a kind of pride that wasn't stubbornness for its own sake, but something closer to a woman refusing to let anyone else finish carrying what she had already carried this far. He didn't push it a third time, he just found himself watching her a beat longer than the trail strictly required, and telling himself it was only because a man ought to keep an eye on someone still recovering from a night buried alive. He wasn't entirely convincing himself of that, and some part of him knew it. They stopped to rest where a fallen pine offered a break from the wind, and Nascha busied herself checking the pouch's cord, while Dyani and Silas shared the last of the dried meat between them, without much conversation. It was Dyani who finally broke the quiet, watching him work, feeling back into his bandaged hand. "Why did you keep coming? After you found the cloth?" Most men would have turned back at the ridge. "Didn't much feel like a choice by the time I saw it." He flexed the hand once, testing it. "Some things a man can't unsee once he's seen them. Figured I'd rather freeze finding out than warm myself wondering." She studied him a moment, something new moving behind her eyes, warmer than wariness, and not yet anything either of them was ready to name. "Then I'm glad you're the kind of man who can't look away." By afternoon, low clouds had begun stacking again over the peaks, promising more weather before the day was through. As they crossed a narrow ridge exposed to the wind, Silas threw up a hand without warning. "Hold!" Everyone froze. Far below, two riders broke from the tree line, moving with the unhurried care of men who were reading ground rather than covering distance. One pointed toward the valley they had left that morning. The other nodded and turned his horse that direction. "They found our trail out of the cabin." Silas kept his voice low. Dyani's face went pale in a way the cold hadn't managed to put there. "They'll search every shelter in these mountains now. Then we don't give them the chance to catch us standing still." Silas started them moving again, faster. As they dropped off the ridge and back into cover, Nascha slowed her pace enough to fall in beside him. "There's something I haven't told you yet." Silas glanced back at her. She looked toward the pouch riding close against Dyani's chest before she went on, her voice dropping to something just above the wind. "The men hunting us believe this stone marks hidden silver." Silas waited. "They're wrong." The words hung there in the cold a moment before she finished them. "It leads to people." Silas felt the whole shape of the last day shift under him again. Heavier this time. Nascha went on, quiet, almost to herself. "Every hidden valley, every winter shelter, every place my people have built to hide our children and our old ones when soldiers or raiders or men like the ape behind us come looking for someone to hurt. My father drew the markings on that stone across 40 years, valley by valley, so that whatever happened to any one camp, the rest could still find each other and start again. It has never once pointed toward wealth. It points toward every place my people have left to be safe. The stone wasn't guarding treasure. It was guarding lives, an entire scattered community's worth of them, and if the men hunting it ever got their hands on the truth Nascha had just handed him, this mountain range would see far worse before it was through than one storm and one long chase. They pressed on in silence after that, each of them carrying the weight of it differently. Dyani's steps had slowed by then, exhaustion finally catching up to whatever strength had carried her this far, and Silas found himself matching his pace to hers without either of them acknowledging it out loud. Nascha, older and no less tired, kept a hand pressed against her side more than once, and Silas noted it without comment, filing it away the way he filed away every small sign of trouble on a trail. The sun sat low and orange behind thickening cloud, and the temperature was already dropping toward whatever the night meant to throw at them. He thought more than once about how easily this whole thing could still end badly. 2 exhausted women, 1 tired horse, and 8 men somewhere on this mountain who believed they had every right in the world to what these 2 carried. The last stretch of the climb tested every reserve any of them had left. The trail wound between cliffs before finally opening into a narrow hidden valley, pine crowding close enough on every side to swallow the place whole, from anyone passing at a distance. Nascha pointed toward a low log shelter built up against the rock. Face, weathered but sound. There. By the time they reached it, the sun had already dropped behind the peaks, and Silas got a fire going fast, grateful for warmth that pushed back a cold that had ridden with them the entire day. As they settled, a soft whistle carried through the trees outside, 2 low notes, and a pause. Silas's hand found his rifle on instinct, but Nascha caught his wrist before he could raise it. Hours! Moments later, 3 Apache scouts stepped into the firelight, and the relief that crossed their faces at the sight of Nascha and Dyani alive told Silas everything he needed to know about how little hope they had been carrying into this valley. One of the scouts studied Silas a long moment before speaking. "You're the one who pulled them from the snow." Silas gave a short nod, not sure yet what the right words were. The scout's expression eased into something closer to warmth. "Then you've saved more than the 2 of them. You've saved us all." Silas looked to Nascha for the sense of that, and she was already working the cord loose from around the pouch, drawing the stone free and setting it into the oldest scout's waiting hands with a reverence that filled the small cabin like a held breath. "It can go home now." The old man turned the stone over once, studying markings he clearly knew far better than Silas ever would before he looked up. "This stone does not point toward gold or silver, or anything a man like the ones hunting us would understand as wealth. It marks every hidden valley our children and our elders can reach when danger comes for them." Silas understood, finally, the full weight of what 8 men had burned a village trying to steal. In the wrong hands, every place these people had ever built to keep their most vulnerable safe would become the opposite, a trap instead of a refuge. He looked around the shelter properly for the first time since arriving, noticing details he'd missed in the rush of getting a fire started. Dried herbs hung in bundles from the rafters. A row of carved figures sat along one shelf, worn smooth by generations of hands. This was not an abandoned outpost. It was a living place, tended and returned to, the kind of quiet inheritance that 8 men chasing rumors of silver would never have understood, even if they had found it. Nascha caught him looking and allowed herself a small, tired smile, the first real one he'd seen cross her face since the drift. Her people had been building places like this since long before any cattle baron or fortune hunter had ever set foot in this territory, she told him, and they would be building them long after every one of those men had been forgotten by the mountains that had briefly hosted their greed. Outside, carried faint on the wind, came a sound that stopped every conversation in that shelter cold: horse hooves. The scouts moved without panic, slipping outside and vanishing into positions among the trees and the broken rock where the failing light swallowed them whole. Silas stood near the doorway watching the narrow trail that fed into the valley, counting his own heartbeat against the growing sound of approaching riders. 4 horsemen came into view, not 8. The rest apparently scattered wide somewhere else on the mountain, still searching. The leader rode ahead of the others, a heavy-set man in a good coat who had clearly spent more seasons giving orders than following anyone else's, and he raised a hand as though he expected to find frightened, defenseless people waiting on the other end of that trail. What he found instead was a valley that had quietly surrounded him the moment he rode into it. Apache scouts rose from cover on every side, bows drawn, arrows leveled with a calm that said more than any shout could have. The riders reined in hard eyes, cutting from one side of the valley to the other, understanding all at once that they had ridden into a place with no way back out except the one their hosts allowed them. The leader's rifle dropped slowly to rest across his saddle. "We came for the stone." The old scout stepped forward, his voice carrying easy across the silence. "It is no longer yours to seek. It was never yours to begin with." The leader's jaw worked, weighing his 4 men against a valley's worth of drawn bows, and finding the arithmetic exactly as bad as it looked. Nobody moved for what felt like a long time. Then, one by one, the riders turned their horses, and rode back the way they had come, without another word passing between either side. Pride had carried those men up this mountain. Something closer to sense carried them back down it. As the last rider vanished into the tree line, the tension that had gripped the valley since the first hoofbeat finally broke, the way weather breaks after it has spent everything it had. The old scout crossed to where Silas stood and pressed the stone briefly into his open palm, letting him hold it for just a moment before drawing it back. You had every reason to leave those two women where you found them and ride on toward your own fire. He weighed the stone once in his palm. Instead, you chose compassion at real cost to yourself. Silas shifted, uncomfortable with praise he hadn't gone looking for. Seemed like the only thing worth doing, given the choice in front of me. The old man shook his head slowly. Many men say those words. Few of them mean it enough to live by it when the cold has already gotten into their hands the way it got into yours. That evening a large fire rose in the center of the valley, and the whole small community gathered around it, children chasing each other through fresh snow, with the particular joy of people who understood exactly how close they had come to losing everything and had gotten it back regardless. Elders passed Silas food without being asked twice. Women he had never met nodded to him across the fire like he had always belonged among them, and somewhere in the space of that one evening he stopped, feeling like a stranger who had wandered somewhere. Nascha found him near the edge of the firelight, watching the children with an expression he hadn't quite settled into words. You could stay a few more days. She followed his gaze toward the fire. Rest before that ride back down. Might just do that. He glanced toward where Dyani stood across the fire, laughing at something one of the children had said, looking nothing like the half-frozen woman he had hauled out of a drift 2 days earlier, and something in his chest pulled tight in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Wouldn't mind seeing this place in daylight a while longer. Nascha's mouth curved, quiet and knowing, the look of a woman who had already seen where this was headed, before either of the two people involved had caught up to it themselves. She left it there, unspoken, and let the fire and the evening do the rest of the talking. Dyani came looking for him a little later, when the fire had burned down to something gentler, and most of the children had been carried off to sleep. She sat beside him without asking permission, close enough that her shoulder nearly touched his, and for a while neither of them spoke, content to let the silence be its own kind of conversation. You didn't have to keep coming after that scrap of cloth. She watched the embers settle. Most men would have turned back at the ridge, storm coming on the way it was. Wasn't much of a choice by the time I saw it. Silas kept his eyes on the fire. Some things a man can't unsee once he's seen them. She studied him a moment, something warm and unguarded, finally settling into her expression. The wariness he had first pulled her out of the snow with worn down to almost nothing now. Then I'm glad you're the kind of man who can't. Neither of them added more than that, but something had shifted between them all the same. Quiet and certain as the snow settling outside the ring of firelight, and Silas found he wasn't in any particular hurry to name it out loud. Some things, he was learning, were better carried a while, before they were spoken aloud to anyone, even the person they belonged to. He stayed 2 more days in that valley before the trails opened enough to make the ride back down sensible. Days spent mending harness that didn't need much mending, and finding reasons to be near the fire whenever Dyani was. And every one of those days deepened something between him and the people who had taken him in without asking anything of him but honesty. He learned the names of children who had adopted him as a personal project within a single afternoon, learned which elder told the best stories and which one told the longest, and learned slowly what it felt like to be trusted by people who had every reason left in the world to trust no stranger at all. One afternoon he found himself helping repair a stretch of fence line at the valley's edge, work he knew without being asked, and by the time he'd finished, 3 of the younger men had drifted over just to talk, curious about the horse he rode and the country he'd crossed to get here. He answered what he could and asked more than he answered. And somewhere in that ordinary afternoon of shared labor, he understood he was being measured in the way people measure a man they might come to trust for a long while rather than a single winter. He did not take that measuring lightly. Out here, a man's word was worth exactly what he'd shown it was worth, nothing given on credit, and he intended to keep earning whatever these people were willing to extend him for as long as they let him. Dyani watched him work that fence line from a distance longer than she needed to, and when Nascha caught her at it, she didn't bother pretending otherwise. There was no shame in watching a man prove himself steady with his hands as well as his word, she said, and Nascha only laughed, low and warm, and went back to whatever she'd been doing before, satisfied enough with the answer not to press further. If you felt that pull too, watching two strangers earn a whole community's trust, one honest choice at a time, tap join beside the channel name and become a channel member. It's a small thing that helps keep frontier stories like this one coming. When the morning finally came to leave, the valley had settled back into the rhythm it must have carried for generations before 8 men with rifles ever threatened to break it, smoke rising steady from a dozen fires, children's voices carrying across snow already losing its edge to a warming sky. Dyani walked with Silas to where his horse waited saddled at the trailhead, Nascha a few steps behind, watching the two of them, the way an aunt watches something she has already decided she approves of. Dyani stopped him before he could mount, her hand finding his arm, holding his eyes the way she had that first night in the cabin when the fire had barely started warming either of them. You saved more than our lives out there, Silas Kerr. You protected our future, too. The whole of it, everyone in this valley, who wasn't even awake to know how close it came to burning down around them. Silas didn't have an easy answer for that, so he didn't try to build one. He just held her gaze a moment longer than the goodbye strictly required, memorizing something about the way the morning light caught in her dark hair, and let that moment carry what words weren't going to manage better anyway. You'll be all right up here. Not quite a question. We always have been something soft, cracked through her steadiness. But I won't forget the man who came looking for a scrap of blue cloth and stayed long enough to earn a whole people's trust. Nascha stepped up beside her niece, offering Silas her hand the way one offers it to an equal, not a stranger anymore in any sense that mattered. Come back through this country again sometime, Silas Kerr. You'll always find a fire waiting. He shook her hand, then turned back to Dyani one last time, and there was a whole conversation neither of them put into words, passing between them in that last look, the kind of unfinished thing that a man carries a long way, down a mountain, and further than that besides. Silas swung up into the saddle and looked out once more, across the valley that had, in the space of a handful of days, stopped being someone else's home, and started feeling like a place he had left a piece of himself behind in. Then he turned the horse toward the trail and started down the leather, creaking under him the only sound for a long while besides hooves in snow. The ride down took less than half the time the climb up had cost him. The trail already broken and the worst of the weather spent somewhere behind the mountains for good, and Silas found himself with more time than he wanted to think over everything the last week had handed him. He had ridden into this country, a man who kept his troubles small and his company smaller, and he was riding back out of it carrying a whole valley's worth of people who now knew his name and would say it, he suspected, for years after he'd stopped being anything more than a story told around their fires. He was not sure yet what to make of that. He only knew it sat differently in his chest than anything else he'd earned in 20 years of quiet, solitary work, heavier in a way that didn't feel like a burden at all. By the time he reached the first low country where the snow thinned back to ordinary winter, he had already decided he would come back before the season turned again, not because anyone had asked it of him, but because some promises a man makes to himself are the only kind that actually hold. He thought of Dyani's hand steady around his bandaged one in the firelight, of the particular way she'd looked at him at the trailhead, like she already half expected to see him again, and he let himself believe, for the length of that ride at least, that she was right to expect it. He rode out of those mountains carrying no reward and claiming none. No silver, no stone, nothing a man could weigh in his palm or spend in the next town he rode into. What he carried instead did not fit in a saddlebag. He had earned the friendship of a people who would remember, for longer than his own lifetime likely allowed. The cowboy who chose kindness on the coldest day that winter had to offer, and asked for nothing in return for it. Somewhere behind him, high in a valley, the world outside would never find on any map a woman who had once whispered 2 words to a half-frozen stranger, stood watching him go. Already certain this wasn't the last time that particular trail would bring him back to her. Neither of them had spoken of it plainly, yet that pull between them. Both of them carried it down out of those mountains all the same, in their own separate directions, waiting for the season that would let them say it out loud. Word of what had happened on that mountain traveled slower than the snow. That had covered it the way word travels in country this wide and this empty. But it traveled all the same. By spring, men in the nearest town spoke of a valley up north where a rifle wouldn't buy a man what an open hand might, and of a cowboy who'd walked away from a chance at a stranger's fortune because he'd decided, somewhere in a snowbank at the end of a long, cold day, that 2 women's lives were worth more than any story about silver. Nobody who told it right ever called it heroism, least of all Silas himself, who would have shrugged the word off the same way he shrugged off most things said in his favor. He would have called it simple decency, the kind any man ought to manage when the choice was put plainly enough in front of him. Not everyone agreed that decency came that easily, which was, in the end, exactly why the story kept being told. Some rescues end the moment the rescued walk away safe. This one was only the beginning of something neither Silas nor Dyani had gone looking for, and both of them, in their own quiet way, were glad the mountain had chosen to give it to them anyway. If this story stayed with you, the way it stayed with us telling it, hit like on your way out and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you want to help keep these frontier stories coming every week, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a member today. Thank you for riding along on this one. We'll see you on the next trail.